Chapter 22 from the book The New Map. Oil and water. Imports for China means everything from iron ore from Brazil to soybeans from Iowa, to components from Vietnam that will be assembled into products in China and sold into the world. But inevitably, imports means energy. For energy has been the foundation of the country's extraordinary economic growth. Energy fuels the global manufacturing platform that is the workshop of the world. Rising incomes in China mean more building, more infrastructure, more cars, more air travel, and ever more energy use. In 2009, China overtook the United States to become the world's largest energy consumer. Today, it alone represents almost 25% of world's energy consumption. Chinese demand will continue to grow, but the rate will slow as service and domestic consumption become a larger share of the economy. Despite the growth of nuclear power and renewables, 85% of China's energy today comes from fossil fuels. The structure of China's energy economy differs from North America's and Europe's. It is heavily reliant on coal, almost 60% of its total energy, compared to just 11% in the United States. Oil is the leading source of energy today in the United States, 37%. In China, it is half that, 20%. Natural gas is just 6% of total demand, though growing fast, compared to 32% in the United States. China's coal imports may fluctuate, but basically coal is a secure domestic source. Not so for oil and not so for natural gas, and that makes the geopolitics of energy a priority for Beijing. The modern Chinese oil industry is less than 60 years old. For Mao's communist government, the cutoff of oil supplies during the Korean War in the early 1950s, and then the later rift with the big brother, the Soviet Union, made self-reliance in oil an absolute priority. That became a possibility in 1959 with the discovery in Manchuria of a giant oil field named Dakin, which means great celebration. By the 1980s, the domestic petroleum industry was meeting the nation's needs and also producing a surplus of oil that was exported principally to Japan. But economic growth sparked domestic demand for oil that eventually grew faster than domestic production. In 1993, China crossed a historic line, one that would shape its perspectives to the present day. It became a net importer of oil. Since then, it has become increasingly dependent on imports. In the 2000s, alarms went off in Beijing about fear of peak of oil supply. The world is running out of oil and the economic growth machine faltering. Apprehension grew about the possibility of bruising competition for constricted supplies, especially with the United States. Similar fears were also current in Washington in those years. In the decade and a half following its entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001, China's oil consumption increased 2.5 times over. It is currently the 18th largest oil producer in the world, at 3.8 million barrels per day. But its demand has surged far ahead of the domestic supply. It has become the world's largest importer of oil. By the beginning of 2020, 75% of the total demand. The concern was not only the volumes of oil, but also whence they came. From where? China is the biggest customer for oil flowing out of the Persian Gulf and through the Strait of Hormuz, the South China Sea, in the superhighway for petroleum imports. Most of them, whether from the Middle East of Africa, pass through the narrow Malacca Strait that loops up into the South China Sea. That is what led then President Hu Jintao to warn in late 2003 about what he called the Malacca dilemma, the risks that come from the dependence on that strait. Certain powers, he warned, could disrupt China's oil supply line. His warning came several months after the US invasion of Iraq. Beijing has had trouble believing that the invasion could be about something so abstract as democracy. It had to be about something concrete, and that had to mean oil. If the United States was worried enough about access to oil to invade Iraq, then China certainly should worry as well. Thus, control over the South China Sea took on a new priority, both because of its importance as a transit route and because of the potential resources under its seabed. About half of the world's oil tanker shipments pass through the South China Sea, not only to China but also to Japan and South Korea. For Japan and South Korea, the possible risk of disruption would come from actions by China. For China, however, there is only one certain power, the United States, and in particular the US Navy. Chinese strategists focus on a potential crisis scenario. Taiwan threatens independence, and China responds with force. The United States, in turn, responds by cutting the South China Sea oil line to China. What would happen next? Escalation is unpredictable ways. Here, then, is part of Beijing's strategic rationale for the 9-dash map and its assertion of sovereignty over those waters. And now that sea lane is not only the highway for oil but also for natural gas. Traditionally, natural gas has been a small player in the Chinese energy mix, but has taken on new importance. In the winter of December 2017, the days in Beijing were unexpectedly clear, crystal clear, and bright blue, though very cold, with a wind that cut sharply across one's face. The characteristic noxious winter pollution, which would blot out both the sun and the mountains to the north in the haze of smog, a cloud of smoke and dirt. Burning the eyes and causing pain in breathing had disappeared. It had disappeared. Air pollution is a health problem and drag on China's GDP. It is also a potent social and political issue, and the government has promised to meet the public's demand for clean air. What that meant was the physical demolition of old coal burning equipment in the northeast China, from which the winter winds would carry pollution down to Beijing. But the winter was colder than expected, leaving the region short of energy and hospitals and facilities without heat. This became a national crisis, and only quick recourse, like a choice to deal with a problem, was to import more natural gas, and as that happened, global prices for LNG spiked. The result that winter was not only a lack of heat in the shivering cold, but also a severe shortage of natural gas. Beijing has moved to ensure that does not happen again. China has domestic gas production and is developing shale gas. It imports pipeline natural gas from Central Asia and now, of course, from Russia, through the Power of Siberia pipeline. Currently, half of China's gas imports are in the form of LNG. China will soon be the largest importer of LNG, but the LNG still has to get there, and that means a good part of it passes through the South China Sea. But what about the possibility that oil and gas resources are waiting to be discovered deep beneath the South China Sea? On May 2, 2014, a flotilla, like a group of small ships of high-powered tugs, towed a huge Chinese drill ship into waters 120 miles east of Vietnam and 180 miles south of China's Hainan Island. Known as HD 981, it was a technological marvel to feel a surprise on one or wonder in scale and capabilities. 40 stories tall, built in 2011 at a cost of $1 billion, capable of drilling 10,000 feet under the seabed. The drilling rig was accompanied by as many as 80 other Chinese ships, as well as aircraft. The Vietnamese surprised announced the arrival of HD 981 and scrambled over 30 ships to challenge HD 981's right to be in those waters, which Vietnam also claimed. China snapped back that the waters were part of the inherent territory, like belonging to the basic nature. The waters around the drilling rig turned into a deadly serious dodging game, as dozens of Chinese and Vietnamese ships to hit with force one another, with the loss of at least one Vietnamese ship. The Chinese used high-powered water cannons to ward off the Vietnamese ships, which Beijing described as the most gentle measures we can take when trying to keep the other side out. Protests erupted in Vietnam itself with street demonstrations, the torching of Chinese and Taiwanese factories, and the deaths of a number of Chinese nationals. As many as 7,000 Chinese nationals had to be quickly evacuated. One night in the middle of July, 2.5 months after its arrival, HD 981 abruptly sailed away. Now the Chinese internet erupted with nationalist fervor, criticizing the government for bowing to US pressure. Officials dismissed the charge and saying that HD 981 had completed its work and was hastening to beat the typhoon season. The Chinese and Vietnamese were sufficiently shaken that, at the end of 2014, both countries pledged to avoid megaphone diplomacy, which they said with some understanding can trigger volatility in public opinion. The HD 981 standoff, a contest with no winner, was one of the most visible of the series of confrontations over oil and gas exploration and fishing rights that have continued in the South China Sea. In July 2019, the Russian company Rosneft, in partnership with Vietnam's state oil company, was drilling in what Vietnam describes as the EEZ, when several Chinese ships abruptly appeared, trailing back and forth in the same waters. The Chinese insisted that the disputed waters were part of the EEZ. Vietnam's president, Nguyen Phu Trong, while calling for restraint, like a way to limiting something, declared that Vietnam would never compromise on its sovereignty. China's defense minister responded, "We will not allow even an inch of territory that our ancestors have left to us to be taken away." In October, the Chinese ships sailed away, but they did so only after Rosneft and its Vietnam partner had wrapped up their drilling. But will the prospects of the South China Sea live up to expectations? Current production from the South China Sea itself is about 900,000 barrels a day, which is less than 1% of world's consumption in 2019. But what about the future? The highest estimate comes from the Chinese source that estimated 125 billion barrels of reserves is still to be discovered. Hopefully, on the same scale as Iraq's and Kuwait's, other projections are much lower. The U.S. Energy Information Administration estimates about 12 billion barrels of undiscovered oil, which corresponds with estimates from international oil companies. It is also though thought that the most likely discoveries will be closer to the shores and only 1/50 would fall into contested waters. The more central and controversial area of the South China Sea is estimated to be less prospective, owing to the thinness of the sediments and insufficient pressure. Moreover, the considerable sea depths and the lack of infrastructure would make the development of any resources expensive. In any event, it is thought that the bulk of any discoveries is likely to be natural gas, not oil. Of course, as a famous American wildcatter said at the beginning of the 20th century, only Dr. Drill knows for sure. Continuing exploration would provide more clarity about the actual resource. At this point, based upon what is known, new discoveries would be meaningful for the countries around the South China Sea and for the countries involved, but would not be significant in the global oil balance. Natural gas discoveries could be larger, but would be higher cost and would have to compete with growing flows of LNG and pipeline gas. For Beijing and Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien-loong, put it the South China Sea as well as Malacca's strait must be kept open to protect China's energy security. What really counts for China's energy security is not the unproven resources that may lie deep under the seabed, far beneath the sea lanes, but rather the sea lanes themselves and what traverses them. That's the end of chapter 22. Next is about China's new treasure ships.